A broken sacrifice. In a small village of Ayatoro, there lived a woman named Tolu, known for her strength, her resilience, and her beauty. Her husband, Femi, was a poor man, a farmer with little more than a few seeds, and a piece of land barely fertile enough to feed his family. But Tolu had seen something in him that others overlooked. A dreamer, a man who could rise if only given the chance. Tolu loved Femi fiercely, and when they married, she vowed to stand by him no matter what it took. She sold her family's gold heirlooms, the ones her mother left her, to help him buy more land. She borrowed money from every corner of the village, even from those who whispered about her sacrifice in dark corners. She worked tirelessly in the fields with him, through rain and drought, nursing their 4 children at her chest while her hands were calloused and cracked from the work. Slowly, through her sacrifice, Femi became a wealthy man. His land yielded crops beyond expectation, and his business expanded. But in the height of their success, tragedy struck. Femi fell ill suddenly and passed away, leaving Tolu a widow with their 4 children. The air felt still, heavy with the kind of silence that fills the space when a life suddenly stops, leaving behind unfinished plans and dreams. At first, Tolu thought her husband's family would rally around her, offer her support, and stand with her in the darkest moment of her life. But it was not to be. The day after Femi's burial, his family came to her house, the house she had helped build with the sweat of her brow. Leading them was Femi's brother, Tunde, a man with greed in his eyes and a bitterness in his soul. They sat in her living room, their faces hard as stone, their voices sharp like blades. "You are still young," Tunde began, not looking her in the eyes. "It is our tradition that when a husband dies, his widow must marry his brother. You will marry me." Tolu's blood turned cold. Her heart raced in her chest, but she kept her face composed. "I will not marry you," she said quietly but firmly. "I will mourn my husband. I will raise my children, that is all." A murmur of disapproval ran through the room like the wind before a storm. Tunde's face twisted into a snarl, and the others nodded in agreement, their lips curling in disdain. "If you refuse, Tolu," Tunde said, his voice rising with anger, "you will lose everything. This house belongs to Femi's family. The land, the money, all of it, none of it is yours. If you do not marry me, you and your children will be cast out like dogs." The words hit her like a hammer to her chest. She had built this life, sacrificed every piece of herself for her husband, for her family. Yet here she was, being told that all of it could vanish in an instant, unless she gave herself to a man she despised. A man whose eyes lingered on her, not with love, but with possession. "I will not marry you," she repeated, her voice firmer now. The room exploded in outrage. Her husband's family rose to their feet, shouting, accusing her of disrespecting tradition, of dishonoring Femi's memory. They called her selfish, wicked, and ungrateful. But Tolu stood her ground, even as their words cut her deeper than any knife could. Days turned into weeks, and the torment only grew worse. The humiliation became her daily bread. Femi's family would show up at her house, standing outside her door, shouting curses and insults. They told the village that Tolu was a heartless woman, a woman who had driven her husband to an early grave with her ambition. They said she was a witch, that she had stolen Femi's wealth for herself. People who once smiled at her in the marketplace now turned their backs, whispering as she passed. She was shunned, alone, and her children, too young to understand, cried in confusion as their mother tried to shield them from the world's cruelty. One morning, she woke to find her house surrounded by Tunde and the other men of the family. They were there to claim it, to take everything from her. "This is your last chance, Tolu," Tunde said, his voice low, threatening. "Marry me or you leave here with nothing." She looked at him, her heart heavy with sorrow, but her resolve remained unbroken. "I would rather die on the streets with my children than marry a man like you." With that, they threw her out. Everything she had poured her life into was ripped away. Her home, her land, her dignity. She stood on the road, clutching her children to her chest, tears stinging her eyes as the weight of her decision settled in. The villagers who passed by did not offer her any sympathy, only cold, judgmental stares. Tolu had sacrificed everything for Femi, and now, because of her refusal to be treated like property, she had lost it all. But in her heart, she knew she had kept the one thing no one could take from her, her dignity, her soul. As she walked away from the house she had once called home with her children in tow, she whispered to herself, "They may take everything, but I will not bow. I will rise again for my children, for myself." In the years to come, people would speak of Tolu's story as a warning, a tale of both heartbreak and resilience. They would forget her words, but they would always remember the woman who refused to let the cruelty of the world break her spirit. Tolu wandered the village aimlessly that day, her feet blistering under the scorching sun as she clutched her children tightly. Her youngest, barely a year old, cried softly against her chest. The older ones, confused and afraid, walked in silence. Every step felt like a betrayal of the life she had known, but there was no turning back. She had chosen this path, the path of integrity, of courage, and it was already covered in thorns. Her husband's family watched her leave from a distance, their faces cold and unforgiving. Tunde stood with his arms crossed, a faint smirk on his lips. He had wanted to break her spirit, to force her into submission, but Tolu's refusal stoked the fire of his pride. He had lost a prize, but he had succeeded in stripping her of everything else. Days turned into weeks. With no home, Tolu and her children found refuge under a tree on the outskirts of the village. They ate what they could gather, wild fruits, water from a nearby stream. At night, Tolu would hold her children close, her body forming a fragile wall between them and the cruel world. She did not weep, though her heart ached with an unbearable weight. She needed to stay strong for her children, for the memory of Femi, for herself. But the village was unkind. Word of her refusal to marry Tunde spread like wildfire. The elders, who were once kind to her when she was Femi's wife, now looked upon her with disdain. They spat out the words disgrace and stubborn woman behind her back, but the whispers always found their way to her ears. People who had once praised her for her hard work now mocked her for being foolish, for throwing away the wealth she had built with her own hands. One evening, as Tolu sat under her tree with her children, a group of women approached her. They were the wives of the village elders, their faces twisted with contempt. "Look at you now," one of them sneered, her voice dripping with malice. "You thought you were too good for our traditions, didn't you? Thought you could stand above the rest of us? Now see where it has left you, a homeless beggar." Tolu said nothing, though her chest tightened with every word. The other women laughed. "Why don't you just marry Tunde?" another woman asked, her tone mocking. "He's a man of wealth and power. You could have your house back. Your children could eat real food instead of dirt." Tolu met their eyes, her gaze unwavering. "I would rather live under this tree forever than lower myself to that man," she said softly, but with steel in her voice. The women exchanged glances, and one of them spat on the ground near Tolu's feet. "Suit yourself, you proud fool, but don't expect any pity when your children starve." With that, they turned and left, their laughter trailing behind them like the hiss of snakes. Days passed, and life became more difficult. Her children grew thin, their eyes wide with hunger. Tolu did her best to feed them, foraging for roots and berries, but it was never enough. The once strong woman felt her strength begin to slip away, her body weakened by the constant struggle. One night, as she lay beneath the tree, her youngest child burning with fever, Tolu stared up at the sky, her heart heavy with despair. She had sacrificed so much for her husband. She had given her very soul to build a life for her family, only to be cast aside like refuse when he was gone. Her mind wandered to the days when Femi was alive, when they had struggled side by side, dreaming of a better future. Where had that dream gone? Why had the gods abandoned her? She thought of the many nights she and Femi had stayed up late, planning for their children's future. All of it now seemed like a cruel joke played by fate. Femi was gone, and with him, the future she had built. As Tolu held her feverish child, a deep anger began to rise within her. It was an anger she had never known, one that burned hotter than the sun above. She was angry at Femi for leaving her, angry at his family for their cruelty, and angry at the village for turning its back on her. But most of all, she was angry at herself, for believing that all her sacrifices would be rewarded, for trusting in a system that saw her as nothing more than an extension of her husband. In this moment, under the dark sky, she realized that she had never truly owned anything. Not the land, not the house, not even her dignity. Everything had been tied to Femi, and when he was gone, it all vanished like smoke. The next morning, Tolu made a decision. She would no longer beg for scraps, no longer wait for the mercy of the village. She gathered her children and set off for the town beyond the hills, a place where no one knew her name, where she could start again without the weight of her past pressing down on her shoulders. She arrived at the town, weary but determined, and found work cleaning and cooking for the town's wealthier families. Though the work was hard, it was hers. For the first time in her life, Tolu felt a sense of ownership over her future. Slowly, she began to rebuild. Her children, though still weak, began to thrive under her care, and the fire in Tolu's heart, though dim, burned steady. Years passed, and the village that had once cast her out began to hear stories of a woman who had risen from nothing, who had rebuilt her life with her own two hands. Tunde, now a bitter old man, heard the stories too, and each one was a sting to his pride. He had tried to break Tolu to own her as he had owned so many others, but she had escaped him. She had risen stronger and more powerful than before, and her name became a symbol of defiance, of resilience. Tolu's tale would be passed down for generations as a warning to those who sought to break the spirit of others. It would remind them that while wealth and power may shift like the sands, the soul of a person, once it is set free, can never be bound again. Years flowed like a slow river, winding with memories of pain, loss, and quiet victories. In the new town where Tolu had settled with her children, her name was spoken with respect. But it was a hard-earned respect, carved out from the ashes of the life she once knew. Her hands were still scarred from years of work, her back still ached from the weight she carried. But there was a new fire in her eyes, a fire that even grief and poverty couldn't extinguish. Her children had grown strong under her unwavering care. The eldest, Kwame, had become a young man with a heart as determined as his mother's. He remembered the days of struggle, the humiliation and the betrayal they had suffered in their village. He carried the memory of his mother's strength like a shield, protecting the family that had once been cast aside. Kwame worked alongside Tolu, ensuring that the family had food and shelter. But he too harbored a deep resentment towards the village and the family that had abandoned them. One day, while walking through the market, Kwame overheard whispers of the village they had once called home. It had changed, the whispers said, but not for the better. Femi's family, once seen as a pillar of wealth and tradition, had fallen into ruin. The crops that had once thrived under Tolu's care were now withered, and the family land had become barren. Tunde, the very man who had tried to claim Tolu as his own, was now a shadow of the man he once was. His wealth had slipped through his fingers like sand, and his pride had crumbled beneath the weight of his own arrogance. Kwame rushed home, eager to tell his mother what he had learned. "Mother," he said breathlessly, "the village, they are suffering. Tunde has lost everything. The land has turned against them." Tolu listened in silence, her hands still busy weaving the fabric that she would sell at the market. Her face remained unreadable as Kwame continued, the fire in his voice growing. "This is justice, Mother. They tried to destroy us, but look how they've fallen. It's what they deserve." Tolu stopped her work and looked at her son. His anger, his thirst for revenge, burned in his eyes, but she saw something more, a reflection of her own pain, the pain that had once driven her to the edge of despair. She placed her hand gently on his arm, her voice steady and calm. "Kwame, my son, you must understand something," she began. "Revenge is a fire that consumes everything in its path, even those who carry it. Tunde and his family are reaping what they have sown, yes, but their suffering will not heal the wounds they left in us." Kwame frowned, confused by his mother's words. "But they took everything from us, Mother. They threw us into the streets like animals. How can you not want to see them suffer?" Tolu sighed deeply, the weight of her past still heavy in her heart. "I do not deny the pain they caused us. I will never forget it. But if we live our lives waiting for the suffering of others, we are no better than they were. I have found peace, not in their downfall, but in knowing that we survived, that we rebuilt what they tried to destroy. And that, Kwame, is the true victory." Kwame listened in silence, the fire in him slowly dimming as he saw the wisdom in his mother's eyes. She had lived through the worst of it, and yet she stood before him, unbroken, unbent, and free. It was in that moment that Kwame understood. His mother's strength did not lie in seeking vengeance, but in her ability to rise above it. As the years passed, Tolu's name grew even more powerful. She became known not just in the town, but in neighboring villages as well, as the woman who had defied tradition and survived. She was sought after for advice, for her wisdom, for the unshakable spirit that seemed to radiate from her like the sun. And though she never returned to the village that had cast her out, her story traveled back to it, like a whisper carried on the wind. In the village, Tunde grew old, bitter, and forgotten. The wealth he had so greedily tried to hold on to slipped away as the land dried up and the crops failed. His family scattered, ashamed of the legacy he had built on cruelty and greed. No one spoke his name with respect anymore. Instead, the villagers remembered Tolu, the woman who had left with nothing but had risen to become something more than they could ever have imagined. But Tolu never gloated. She never sought out the village, never cared to see the fall of the people who had once humiliated her. She had found her peace far from them, in the simple joys of raising her children, in the knowledge that she had carved out a life of her own, free from the chains of tradition that had tried to bind her. She had learned that true power did not come from wealth or land, it came from within. One day, as she sat outside her modest home, watching the sunset with her children by her side, Tolu smiled softly. She had weathered the storm, the harshest winds life had blown her way. She had been tested, broken, and cast aside, but she had rebuilt herself stronger, piece by piece. Her children were her legacy, not the land or the house she had lost. The strength she had passed on to them would last longer than any material possession. They would carry her story forward, but more importantly, they would carry her spirit. The spirit of a woman who refused to be broken, who chose dignity over submission, and who understood that true freedom lies not in what we possess, but in who we are. And so, Tolu's tale became not just a story of loss or survival, but a story of rebirth. It was a reminder that, though the world may try to strip us of everything we hold dear, there is one thing it can never take: our spirit, if we choose to keep it.